If US President Trump tore up the JCPOA over 2 years ago, his own latest resolution against Iran was literally trashed. In answer, the US threatened to trigger the snapback mechanism. This way, if the UN arms embargo on Iran were not to be extended by way of that resolution, instead all UN sanctions would snap back on Iran. But the US is no longer a part of the JCPOA. So how can it trigger a mechanism foreseen by the JCPOA? That was yesterday's argument. A logical argument, however, should hold for all time. But there are those analysts that believe the US does have a loophole through which to press the trigger and snap back all sanctions on Iran. Those analysts may be just a handful, but they're still there, as is the US's might. The UN Security Council did vote against the US resolution very recently, providing the exception to the rule, might is right. But will the lesson be remembered, or will the US get its way yet again? For a closer look at precedents and legal fine print, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. Here's the US argument after the disastrous defeat with the resolution. The JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal was codified by a Security Council Resolution 2231. The US is a UN Security Council member. So the United States must still be a participant in the deal. But that's like saying my brother and I are members of the same family, so I own whatever he owns and have a say in it. Mr. Izadi is Doctor of International Studies. I met with him to see where the trigger loophole might have emerged. The US still seems to think it has a right to trigger the snapback mechanism. How on earth, when it's pulled out of the JCPOA?
There is no loophole. They claim things. They claim that they can use a snapback mechanism when they cannot. So they can claim anything. But there is no loophole they can use. There is no legal argument. Even people within the Trump administration, like Brian Hook, in December of last year, when he was asked whether the US is going to use the snapback mechanism, Brian Hook said that we are not part of JCPOA. We are not going to be able to do that. If someone wants to use that snapback mechanism, it should be a country that's part of JCPOA still, and we are not. And he's an attorney, so he understands these things. That's the correct answer. Obviously, when they left the agreement, they did not think about this issue. They did not need to announce their departure so clearly.
Mr. Marandi is an expert in international law and a university professor. He got to talk to us via Skype.
Since the United States left the deal, and since they're no longer a part of the P5+1, and it's now just the P4+1, the United States is no longer a partner for it to be able to use the trigger mechanism. So the foolish thing that the Americans did was that they left the agreement before they used the trigger mechanism. It's sort of like a drunk person who goes outside the house and locks himself outside, and then he curses the rain. It's his own doing. The United States made this foolish mistake.
For actual participants to the deal, here's how the snapback mechanism, or dispute resolution mechanism rather, can be triggered. Under that provision of the deal, if Iran is caught cheating, any of the signatories can unilaterally reimpose sanctions. Iran did not cheat, it did not sneak around with its nuclear program, and it did not hinder inspections. It was in fact in full compliance with the deal, as certified by the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, 15 times. Mr. Salimi Namin is a contemporary history researcher. Let's have him predict if again the lesson learned will be lost.
در این حال من معتقد نیستم I don't believe that the JCPOA produced no fruits for us. The most significant outcome of the JCPOA was the knowledge it bestowed upon the younger generation. It helped disclose the enemy so that the younger generation would know the enemies quite well. Therefore, we have to see the JCPOA from such perspective. It's also important to know what would happen in the future.
By way of paragraph 36 of the deal, should a party find other parties were not meeting their commitments, it would have grounds to cease performing its commitments after consultations. And Iran did try for a whole year to get European signatories to fulfill their commitments in overcoming US secondary sanctions and conducting trade with Iran. It was only after they couldn't perform that Iran restarted its nuclear program, or rather started stepping back from its nuclear commitments in reversible stages. So the US wants to punish Iran for taking a defensive measure allowed by the deal. Should the US succeed against all odds, what will it mean for the UN?
Unfortunately, what the US has done is they engage in this law of jungle. What they have done so far with 2231, which is a UN resolution. The US is a permanent member of the Security Council. The US is supposed to follow UN resolutions like any other member, especially when you're a permanent member of Security Council. You have to be more cautious with regard to these resolutions. And what the US has done in the last 2 years is that not only the US government is not following the resolution, they're punishing any country that wants to follow, because Article 36 of the 2231 talks about countries not interfering in Iran's external trade. And the US is exactly doing that. Not only they're interfering, they're punishing other countries that want to trade with Iran.
Here's a question. If the US is really party to the deal, why did it unilaterally, illegally pull out? Pulling out of a deal has certain provisions and calls for compensation to be paid to remaining parties. You can't break the law of your own deal and expect others to follow it. And you can't force other parties to change parts of the deal because you're having afterthoughts about it. The argument against US actions is foolproof. So now the US has turned to brute force, to either force Iran into talks and an amended New Deal, or to destroy the JCPOA altogether, so that a possible new administration cannot put it back together again. We've been pondering on the legal right and wrong and possibility of the US plan or claim, even on whether it'll pull it off. But what if it does against all odds? What will that mean for Iran, really, the UN sanctions snapping back on this country? After all, we've already been undergoing maximum pressure US sanctions and their globalization by secondary sanctions anyway. Iran's economy undoubtedly has suffered considerably. But Iran has yielded neither on the nuclear front nor on the regional front. In fact, its nuclear program is today more advanced than before the US withdrawal in May 2018. Just a day after the US said it would activate the so-called snapback procedure, Iran unveiled 2 missiles with a longer range than before. Missiles named after the commanders assassinated by the US right after New Year 2020. Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandis. US Ambassador to the UN, Kraft, said after America lost the vote, "In the coming days, the United States will follow through on that promise to stop at nothing to extend the arms embargo." Ms. Fallahi is MP for Elam along the western strip of Iran. Let's hear her out.
Iran has boosted its capabilities in arms development. Many nations in the world are currently looking to buy arms from Iran. Iran has grown into a center of excellence in terms of missile manufacturing. Today, missiles are serving as our tool of power, tool of deterrence.
The United States has engaged in illegal wars in the past, many of them, and they could engage in another illegal war. The only problem they have with Iran is that Iran's military is quite powerful. We saw what Iran did to US drone, quite sophisticated US drone. We know what Iran did to the American base in Iraq after the assassination of General Soleimani. So Iran is not Afghanistan, Iran is not Iraq, Iran is capable of defending itself. And if this defense capability was not there, I think US would have attacked Iran many years ago.
For now, it is claiming Iran has significantly violated the 2015 nuclear deal. Well, again, Iran is within its rights with the step-back mechanism, which it has mildly employed to protect its interests against US sabotage and violation of the deal. US stunts and the arguments they provoke have made for a vicious circle we should perhaps break, we the global community, rather than play into the US's hands. The thing is, even if you're doing something wrong, you have to do it cleverly. I mean, what cleverness do you find in US actions?
ما باید آمادگی رو داشته باشیم که از این بازی‌های سیاسی مدام ایجاد بشه برای اینکه هم
We have to be prepared as such political games are fabricated from time to time to keep the world busy and waste our time. Therefore, it has become a routine. The Americans are trying their best to undermine all of Iran's strengths. It's because the only nation resisting US interests and forming a front of resistance against the US and political entities following US order is Iran. The US's injustice-based interests and not Americans' interests have been definitely threatened.
The US's point of view is at best provocative, no more than battering at closed doors. It's violated the deal and pulled out illegally, and it accuses Iran of violations. If that's not ludicrous. Dmitry Polyansky, a Russian deputy ambassador to the UN, tweeted, "Looks like there are two planets, a fictional dog-eat-dog one where US pretends it can do whatever it wants without cajoling anyone, breach and leave deals, but still benefit from them, and another one where the rest of the world lives and where international law and diplomacy reign." This time, Russia's Western fellow signatories to the JCPOA have been in agreement with regard to Iran. But time for a quick break to see what other media outlets have to say. For that, I give you Shahrzad.
Hi, my name is Shahrzad Manucheri, and we'll be reviewing the latest update on the US's bullying and non-stop confrontation with the world. CNBC News reports US prepared to enforce sweeping UN sanctions on Iran, Pompeo says. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo asserted that Washington would enforce sweeping sanctions on Iran, even though the United Nations Security Council voted not to extend an arms embargo on Iran. "We're not going to let them have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to let them have hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth from selling weapon systems. Every leader around the world knows it's a bad idea," Pompeo said. Last week, the Security Council voted to not extend the international arms embargo on Iran, a decision that prompted Pompeo to formally notify the group on August 20th of the US intention to snap back or restore all UN sanctions on Iran. And an article by Times of Israel claims Kushner extends US peace offer to Iran, says Trump ready to talk, meet leaders. The United States is willing to enter peace negotiations with Iran if US President Donald Trump is re-elected in November, top White House official Jared Kushner says, as Washington tries to snap back UN sanctions against the Islamic Republic. Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, said the US president would be willing to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and other leaders in an interview with Voice of America. Peace is a noble thing. It's a good thing, and it's a very important thing if we want to have a world where everyone can have economic opportunity in order to live a better life than their parents, Kushner said. President Trump is willing to talk. He's willing to meet Iran's leaders. But he's going to be tough, he added. In an article by Daily FX, we see crude oil may rise on renewed US-Iran tensions ahead of 2020 election. Renewed US-Iran tensions may boost Brent crude oil prices if strained bilateral relations stir concerns of politically induced supply disruptions. Tensions between the US and Iran are growing after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the US is initiating the reimposition of UN sanctions against Iran. Markets may therefore scrutinize President Donald Trump's speeches, particularly as they relate to foreign policy towards Iran. Over the past 2 years, Brent has seen episodes of politically induced shocks. At one point, prices spiked as much as 20% over the course of 24 hours after such an instance. An oil-positive, risk-off dynamic from international entanglements between Tehran and Washington is not unfamiliar to investors. Throughout 2018 and most of 2019, crude oil prices spiked on several such occasions, ranging from drone strikes to clashes with oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. In early 2020, the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani led to fears of a full-blown military confrontation. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
The US's draft resolution, revised milder draft resolution of 11th August even, got a yay only from the Dominican Republic. That's just one of the 15 Security Council member states. 11 members abstained from a vote, leaving China and Russia alone in voting no, but sparing them the trouble of having to veto a possible vote in favor. That could happen if 9 out of the 15 voted yes to the resolution and extending the UN arms embargo against Iran. That embargo expires on October the 18th by way of the JCPOA.
I think the behavior of the current regime in Washington has been so outrageous across the board that no one wants to help Trump, especially with only 2 to 3 months left until the elections in the United States. I think that the Europeans and the rest of the world, they have their own reasons not to support Trump. I believe that the Europeans would rather Biden become president, even though in my opinion, it doesn't really matter for Iran, Biden or Trump.
It would be wrong to think that the Iranian nation would buckle down under sanctions or bow to pressure. If you proceed with your current policy, you will have to confront Iran militarily at the end of the day. Would a military confrontation be in the US and European interests? All of them say no. Nobody would defend the military option. Therefore, if we see there are some differences on whether to let the JCPOA survive or kill it, it's because if the JCPOA is killed, the war option would be inevitably on the table.
It's not just a matter of why, but till when. Will the Security Council hold in confronting the US?
Are the Europeans ready to pay a price on the international arena for their agreements? The response is negative. I mean that they are not ready to stand against US bullying. If the US imposes its own policy, the Europeans would not dare reciprocate. You will not find such willpower in Europe to take Iran's side against the US.
Even with all said and done, Donald Trump actually promises to reach an agreement with Iran within 30 days of being re-elected, if. That would be to rewrite the JCPOA or write up a new deal to limit also Iran's ballistic missile program and regional policy. But Iran is predominantly adamant it will not get into talks unless the US gets back into the JCPOA. If talks are to reach a deal, well, Iran already has a deal with the US and 6 other powers. The timing of the US's claims on the JCPOA can't go unnoticed just before presidential elections, November. But will they actually mean a long-term win for Donald Trump if he does get re-elected? He claims he'll bring Iran to the negotiating table in no more than a month. But going by precedents, pressure and bullying only tend to push Iran in the opposite direction. So how are things going to work out for the US henceforth?
Trump is not interested in negotiations. He's interested in a photo op for his campaign because he hasn't done much on foreign policy. But the Trump administration is not available to give concessions towards Iran. the people who are in the White House now were criticizing the Obama administration for negotiating with Iran. The argument they have is that when you negotiate, you have to give Iran something, and they want to do maximum pressure. They don't want to give Iran anything.
We talked of how snapback sanctions might or might not further affect the Iranian economy. But what can a snapback and ignoring allies' advice to the contrary mean for the US? Well, where it could once forge a consensus among the world community, it has now managed to ensure a united front of allies in opposition to itself, the US. And any reactions from a disheartened Iran will be on the US. Iran will cease commitment to the JCPOA and may even cede NPT membership.
The Americans and the Brits have pushed the Iranian nation to the brink of collapse several times, but the Iranian nation resisted. The massacre committed by the British government in Iran during World War I by sending 10 million Iranians to war fronts was aimed at crushing the Iranian nation. The country did not collapse. Even today, many experts in the US and Europe are telling Western governments that they are mistaken if they think they can force the Iranian nation to accept their will.
The NPT or Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty binds signatories by IAEA guidelines and the commitment to inspections. In feeling vulnerable, Iran will likely expand on its missile program also and regional influence. Now, how can that be in favor of extending an arms embargo on this country?
The problem that the US has is that the diplomatic corps is not that professional. Pompeo was a congressman, was the head of CIA for a short while. He's not really a diplomat. And other people, the true diplomats in the State Department don't agree with what Trump is doing. They're not doing their job properly because they don't believe in these things. So when you have people not believing in what they're doing, and then the people who believe in what they're doing, they're not diplomats, this is what you get.
With US non-diplomacy, the JCPOA probably won't suffer as much as the US maximum pressure approach. Furthermore, the US will find it difficult to get anyone to sign off on its safety measures in any deal, in case it turns back on them. But more importantly, the Security Council as a guarantor of multilateral diplomacy will lose credibility. And on a lower level, relations between the permanent members of the Security Council will further deteriorate at a time when the world needs to unite to fight the common enemy, the corona pandemic. Perhaps it's time to change what makes the UN tick.
This idea of a veto power is not something that's really useful for the 21st century. Giving a number of countries a way of standing up to the whole world, what the US is doing now, is not going to be useful for international peace and security. You could, in practice, have a UN resolution today because 13 countries don't accept what the US is doing. So they could easily pass a resolution condemning the United States, right? Why can't they do it? Because if they present that resolution, the US will veto it. So we are realizing that this veto power is not something that is contributing to international peace and security, and I think the veto power should be eliminated, or at least be eliminated for the United States, because the US is abusing this power.
What we see today is 5 countries. Some of them are very small and becoming less relevant, like France and Britain. And these 5 countries have authority over special authority which far outweighs their global status. For example, when we look at Iran is larger and in size and has a larger population than both Britain and France. Brazil is much larger than these countries, or Indonesia, or India. Many countries across the globe are not fairly represented in the United Nations and in the UN Security Council.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team, but don't forget to watch at the same times next week and each week after, as there's plenty more to come. And do leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.